So we've had a really good chat about the sort of broader conceptual ideas about how we perceive sounds and about the dimension and perceptual heaviness from our associations with our experience of being human. Moving towards your mix that you've done for this project, there are clear challenges that are presented with the performances with this, from very slow half-time sections to blast beats, and obviously there's down tuning, massive vocal stacks, brass sections, synth, strings, etc. When you first got the multi-track, did you develop an idea of where you wanted to go with it, or did you just start with the drums or start with the vocals? What was your initial approach?
Yeah, so I guess when I start a mix, I'm not really thinking in those terms of like the challenges and stuff like that. The first thing I'll be doing is just importing tracks and working on the drums always first, because it's the one element where I feel like you need to do a lot to them to get them up to par for modern heavy music mix. Like there's a lot to be sorted out. There's maybe like stripping of the toms, although that was taken care of here. There's kind of gauging bleed levels, like signal to bleed kind of levels, figuring out whether the room sound is going to be like usable in terms of making it really loud in the mix, or if there's too much cymbals or the drums aren't really, you know what I mean? Performance elements, like are you going to need to use samples to flatten stuff out or not? So that'll be the first thing that I'm kind of scoping out, and I'll be doing that by working on it at the same time. Like I'll just be loading up the tracks and doing some of my typical moves, doing some of my moves to reduce bleed. And once the drums are kind of sounding pretty decent, that's when I'll start to bring in the other elements, because you never know if it's right. I'm pretty good at getting the levels and stuff on the drums with no reference, but you need to bring in the other elements, the guitars and the bass especially, to kind of get a feel, and for things to start hitting the master bus chain in a way where you can really start to get a feel for stuff. And then when it comes to having lots of layers on top, I've arrived at a place where I like to think about it pretty simply as just like mix the rock band and put the other stuff on top, and like not in a half, like not in a slapdash way, but just not overthinking it really. Like hopefully the song arrangement's going to allow for those things, or they're doing something harmonically that's interesting and wants to be heard. So just be a question of finding levels and maintaining dynamics basically.
Okay, and staying with the subject of drums, we briefly chatted earlier about what your approaches were with sample reinforcement. What was your general approach, firstly with the kick drum samples wise, and then moving on to the snare and toms?
Yeah, so I did end up using a bit of kick sample. As I remember it wasn't in from the start. I think I was working with the natural kick for a while, and it ultimately came down to maybe wanting a slightly different tone than was captured from the drum, getting something more like a clacky, maybe slightly lower tuned, less muffled sound from the drum, which is, you can't really generate. I mean, not yet. I'm sure AI is going to allow that to happen very easily very soon. But for now, I decided I wanted that, and also just to help with some of the dynamic, well, more the timbre shifts between the fast sections and the slower sections. And then when it came to the snare, I mean, I was approaching this in having in mind that we were going to be doing this, and wanting to show a lot of my standard approaches to things. So I didn't want to change things a lot by putting loads of snare sample on there, which is not something I typically do. So I wanted to work with the natural snare close mics as much as possible. I did end up supplementing with a snare room multi-sample, which is more to do with the character of the room mics, perhaps not having a huge snare focus. And also, well, they were mono only, the room mics, I'm remembering now, were mono mics.
There were various ones that were various setups within the room. There was sort of like I think there was a mono Coles 4038, and then it was a pair of U87s, if I remember rightly.
So yeah, in the end, I didn't use any of the natural room sound. So what I did want was some snare decay, which I used a triggered room sample as well as some drum reverb from.
So the two kick sources you used from the recording, which were they?
So I used both because I forget what was provided. I used the Beta 91 and the sub kick.
Okay. And how do they sound in isolation then together?
Well, so they're running through a gate, perhaps. It might not sound right, but
yeah,
we can monitor a bit louder, can't we? So that's the Beta 91. Going through some processing, and the sub kicks really just adding some lows.
And how does the Beta 91 sound in isolation, and same with the sub kick?
So the Beta 91 sounds like this. And it looks to me, I've done some nifty stuff here, reducing the dynamics of the top end of the kick in this multiband saturation plugin, as well as saturating the top end of the kick. But that will be mainly for bleed management purposes, that dynamic reduction in the top end, so that you get the click and then not much cymbal through. And then we've got the sub kick. Which looks like I've also done quite a narrow Q boost, really low down actually, around 40 Hertz.
Yeah.
And used a shelf to cut out a lot of what was above it. So the two together come out sounding like, and summed through some processing, I should add.
And what's the processing it's summed through, Adam?
So this is a really important part of not needing to use samples, is this drum leveler plugin that you're smiling, so I think you've probably come across it before. So that's able to flatten out the peak levels of the kick within certain threshold. And I'm using it looks like for a tiny bit of gating as well, but the important part is this compression band here, which I've got turned almost all the way up, that's going to be maintaining certain peak levels, which will be why when we auditioned the two mics separately, they sounded very even in volume, and then when heard together, the volume was still the same because they're all getting kind of flattened dynamically through here. So we've got that, and then I've got some EQ, and it looks like I'm actually doing quite a lot dynamically in the low end, and in the high end as well. So some of these are strategies really to flatten out the timbre of the kick drum between the different dynamics. So I'm doing, for example, a big boost here up at 8 and a bit K, but I'm also dynamically on the same band reducing. So the harder the hit is, the less of that boost is being applied functionally in the transient. So that's a way of making sure that when the drummer starts stomping in the slow sections, it doesn't suddenly get really clicky, and yeah, that the top end's there on the softer hits.
And that's with the two acoustic sources summed to that EQ, but is the sample also summed through that bus?
It's not.
It's
the
not
sample
separate,
is
yeah.
not. So the sample and the kick are going up here to what I've labeled kick VCA, which further has a limiter, a bit of further EQ, and just a gain trimming thing. So we could get into the, well, first of all, let me finish the processing on the kick mics.
Yep.
So I've got a kind of opto style compressor here, which I like to give it like a really strong thup kind of character, but in order that the low end doesn't get too flattened and kind of reduced by that, I've got a little bit of mix dialed in so there's some dry signal going through. So without, it sounds like, and then with. Obviously that's also increasing the level quite a lot as well. I'm using a little bit, I really like this this plugin by Slate. It's just like a high and low kind of big broad move EQ. I quite like it on kick and snare, just for kind of bringing, yeah, without having to think too much, just being like, okay, I want the kick to be a little bit more present, and I'll use a little bit dialed in on there. Same with the snare. And then here I'm doing some saturation with this kind of very colored sounding saturation device here, which is also functioning as a bit of a trim, and it's also got a bit of high pass filtering dialed in on it as well. So that is going to be splatting the transient a little bit, flattening it level wise a little bit, and just generating more harmonics so it sounds a bit more aggressive. I can do without and with if you'd like. So this is without, and with everything on. So that's the natural kick. and then going through the VCA with the trigger sample, which sounds like this. So you can hear the sample has a lot of that clack, like kind of that 3K-ish kind of like real slappy kind of clack character, which is what I felt like I wasn't getting from the natural mics. And then that all summed through the VCA together sounds like. And just based off peak level, it looks like it is marginally more sample than natural. It's probably about 60% sample. Through the VCA, there's a limiter here, flattening out any like big spikes and just making sure the kick stays really even. Obviously, a big part of working with natural kicks is trying to make them sound consistent. And then it looks like I'm just doing a little bit of sculpting, actually adding a bit more clack around that kind of 3 and a bit K. And then finally, yeah, just trimming back a little bit because it was a little bit hot and I didn't want to have to redo the automation, which is fairly minor. It just looks like in the midsection I've brought down the overall kick level a touch.
Yeah.
Then
onto the snare drum. I'm very interested in what you've done to the acoustic snare recording. Did you use the snare side mic or just the top and the bottom?
I kept it really simple with just top and bottom.
Yeah.
So I'm going to bypass the things on here because that's going to be quite important so you can hear what's going on. So listening just to the snare top, and bear in mind, I do have parallel compression active on my drum bus.
Yeah.
That's the natural snare. You can hear it's getting a bit of compressed punch, which is nice. I decided to use Apogee's soft limiter, which I really like. It's just it's kind of what they have on their hardware interfaces, just prevents overs, but I quite like using it. It's got a slight kind of drivey saturation character as well. So I'm using that because you can see just visually there's a huge discrepancy between the volume of the snare in certain sections where it's practically at 0, and then other sections where it's a lot quieter during the blast. So this is evening out the peak levels a little bit so that compression further downstream has a more consistent envelope. So and that's taking more between 1 and 3 dB off the hard hits. So it's really quite transparent. And then this is a very popular trick of mine, as in something I use a lot, where I've created a band around 1K in this same multiband saturator I was using on the kick, and then I've turned the dynamics knob almost all the way down, and this instantly gets rid of a huge amount of bleed. So without, and then with.
Are you gating as well, or no? There's gating as well, or is
there is gate further downstream on the
further
snare
downstream?
bus.
Okay, yeah, got you.
That's also doing a little bit of saturation. It looks like I've also increased the top end just a touch on the high band on that. And then finally, I'm doing a little bit of EQ here. So this is a move I like doing. It's a high Q value shelf, so that you get a peak, which you can kind of target the fundamental of the snare drum, and then it's also kind of decreasing any mud above that. So it's quite a steep fundamental enhancer and kind of muddiness cutter. And then it looks like I've done a similar thing up top to what I did on the kick, where I've used a dynamic band to even out the attack of the drum a little bit. And there was a specific notch that's probably the character of the microphone with the snare wires. I was finding it a little bit ratty sounding around kind of like 5K-ish. So without the EQ, and then with. You can really hear it enhancing that low end in a way that's not adding mud. All right, so moving on to the snare bottom channel. That being the natural snare bottom. It looks like I've wanted to take out a little bit of the kind of upper mid thwack, kind of 1K-ish, and then also just kind of revoice that. Again, it's probably, is it an SM57 on the bottom? Yeah, 57. That does tend to have a bit of a kind of peakiness around 5, 6K, so I've kind of reduced that to give a more flat kind of white noise character to the snare bottom. And I've got Saturn here, and I think I'm just using it to overdrive. Just adding some extra saturation. I'm actually cutting a little bit of bass as well, and since it's possible to do that there. And I guess here I'm trying to generate, again, more harmonics into that that kind of rattle sound so that it sounds more even and white noisy. And also just to take a little bit of the peak off the snare bottom signal, so it's got a bit more of like a flat character that's going to blend with a really punchy snare top. And that doesn't need to be there. And then I'm using a transient designer here. I don't always do this. It kind of depends on how tight the wires were turned up on the drum when they were played. Here I felt like maybe the wires could have had like a more loose character to them. So here I'm boosting the sustain quite considerably, actually. Again, bear in mind this is going to feed into a gate. So it's more about having like a specific envelope which is filled with that white noise sound. And then, yeah, a bit of the excessive sustain is going to get trimmed off. And this probably got added quite late in the day. I've cut a little bit around 4K, probably just dialing in that kind of wire sound in the snare. So those two summed together with a little bit of reverb only applied to the snare top to sound like this. Actually, you're not even hearing the reverb because that bus isn't in play at the moment. First of all, then I'm gating that. I guess expanding is probably a more correct term. Keeping a little bit of sound around the hits. I'm increasing the amount of top end, and it looks like around here I'm doing a dynamic reduction on that same fundamental frequency of the drum, just to prevent it from getting too boxy, especially on softer hits. This is something where like a blast beat can become problematic if you've boosted a load of 200 into the snare. That works fine when you've got a lot of balance in the upper mid-range because the drum is hitting the drum hard. But when he starts doing a softer center hit, it's so much less bright sounding that suddenly that fundamental tone can become this really overwhelming kind of character. So that's probably why I'm doing what looks like about 3 dB dynamic reduction around there. Again, just kind of fine-tuning the high end to get it to work in the mix. And I've ended up also low passing it, which is a move which I don't typically do. And that is specifically because of the cymbal bleed. Just trying to reduce that a little bit. In an ideal world, that would have been recorded with like a hypercardioid mic, which would have meant that the cymbal bleed would have been kind of less audible in the signal. So that would then kind of round out the EQing on the drum. If I show you what that sounds like with the EQ engaged. So it's adding a bit of a kind of, a bit of extra snap. Then here I'm compressing pretty heavily with a slow attack and fast release, saturating quite aggressively afterwards. So I'm compressing hard because for me, snare close mic compression is about how a drum sounds to you in the room. Like when you hear a snare in the overheads, it actually has way more of a focus on the attack and less on the sustain. And the room mics, once you kind of forget about the room ambience, also you're hearing more of the attack of the drum than the detail of the sustain. But obviously that close mic that's so close to the head is getting loads of sustain and less of the kind of attack. So that to me is why you need to compress a snare close channel quite a lot so that it starts to sound more like a real drum does in a room. But then you can end up with a very spiky transient at the same time, which is where using some pretty heavy-handed saturation can help.
Interesting that at that point, am I right in saying that you've sometimes, just thinking about snare and compression, you've adopted master bus processing compression with faster attack times to control the transient of the snare on previous sessions? Is it sometimes the same with your bus compression for the snare? Do you sometimes go for faster attack times to get more of a, or do you generally go with the longer attack times?
Yeah, I'm pretty, for me, part of the character of my mixes is this kind of interplay between generating lots of attack on the close mics and then flattening that out and filling it out with parallel compression and the way the master bus works. I have rarely done it where I've done a fast attack on the close mic with a particularly high-tuned snare or something which is very attack focused, but the problem can also be bleed there. You're squashing that peak down in such a way that makes the bleed relatively more loud. So I tend not to do that so much on the close mic.
And from that really important perspective that you're highlighting about the sustain of the snare, and you were looking at the transient designer with the snare bottom there, is it sometimes the case where you're looking to balance things out? You mentioned balancing out the transient heavy snare with the sustain from elsewhere in the signal chain, that you will look to your snare sample for that sustain and ring?
Rarely.
Right.
So, I think you can get sustain on a snare sound in many ways in the mix. It could be a ringy sound, which is not my typical approach. I tend to get it more from room sound, or whether it's sampled room or real room, and to an extent reverb. Some people lean really heavily on the reverb and none of the other things. But for me, yeah, I like the carry of the snare drum to be that kind of explosive room sound. And I don't really go for much ring on my drums. Partly that's because during tracking, I find a really ringy drum is far harder to manage. You can hear the tuning slip a lot more. You can hear the variations in the drummer's hits a lot more. When the sustain's kind of got a different character on every hit because they're human and they're not hitting it identically every time, especially when they're really trying hard. That stuff to me kind of flags that error checking thing I was talking about before a lot more than when the drum's more damped down. And it's more of the kind of blatty kind of attack of it, and then we can manipulate the attack character using dynamic EQ, or just if it's hit consistently enough, regular flat EQ and compression.
Sure. And then your snare aux that you've got there that you're feeding the top and bottom to, are you also feeding the room sample to that as well?
I'm not, because
That's separate.
Yeah, because I don't want the room sample going through like this very hard, slow attack compression, and I want to be able to kind of EQ that as well separately. So as you can see here, I'm using this presence knob thing again, which I think is kind of like a 4.5K lift on the snare, just to make the snare drum cut through the mix a little bit more. And that would be something I'd dial in with the whole mix playing.
Sure. And then could we have a listen to the snare drum without the compression and with the compression there?
Yep. So without compression, and then. So I compress quite aggressively, quite frequently. I'll be up around 10 dB kind of thing.
Yeah. And your signal chain with gating is an interesting one, because the traditional approach is often to gate first. Whereabouts is the gate? Is the gate on your aux, your snare aux? Is it later down the chain after the processing on the snare top and bottom, is it?
Yeah, so the top has that like top end expansion thing happening directly on it. And then the top and bottom feed to the aux, and the first thing on the aux chain is the gate. And I like to gate the two of them together because then they have the same envelope. I think some people specifically prefer to have separate control over the two, but for the way my mixes have evolved, that's just the way I like to do it.
Sure. And back to the idea of that you like to get the sense of sustain from the room and from the reverbs. Do you have a general approach to your reverb sends? Will you send from the snare aux, or do you like to send from samples and do the Andy Wallace trick of having the clean feed from the samples? Or does it vary with every project?
It used to just be a send from the aux. As of a couple of years ago, I've kind of moved to preferring the sound of the reverb just on the top mic, so that you're not getting the ratty kind of. I think my mixes have started using more and more bottom snare actually, and I found that going to the reverb didn't have a character I liked. I've even done a couple of mixes where I've duplicated the snare top completely raw and put a reverb 100% wet on that. Not even done anything to tame the bleed. And that can sound really good. It's a much more mid-rangey reverb sound, and you've got a little bit of a kind of almost a room effect of the other kit pieces minimally bleed-wise kind of coming through and being sent to that reverb.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it was kind of one of those things I did. I guess it came from during tracking, liking how the reverb was sounding, and it was just a raw drum recording, and I just had a reverb send on the snare top, and wanting to carry that through into the mixing phase, and thought, well, I'll just melt off the snare top naturally raw as it was during the session, and leave it like that as kind of part of the sound. So.
And a great sense of cohesion as well with everything.
Yeah.
Everything going to the reverb. Do you ever take a reverb send from room mics if you use them to reverb?
Sometimes. sometimes, not always. I might sometimes do it on a mono mic if I want to lean on it more heavily in the mix and want it to kind of spread a little bit. I might do it on a sampled room if I want more length, and particularly for like a big snare bomb moment where you want a massive sustain. Instead of just putting loads of reverb on the close mic, it can be cool to put that on the room mic and really kind of spread it to oblivion.
Sure. And then can we have a listen to the room sample that you're using?
Absolutely, yeah. So the room sample, this was a sample I took from Real World Studios. Tried to find one that's like a similar tuning as well. Yeah. That's something some people like to stack, like the room sound from a low tuned snare with high tuned close mic, you know, kind of mix and match. For me, I'm looking for that cohesion. I kind of want it to almost sound like it's the real thing. Yeah. So it sounds like, oh, and it looks like I'm actually sending a fair bit of that to the reverb, as you can hear. So without the reverb, and then with,
yeah. And the reverb that you're using there?
Yep, that is Logic's ChromaVerb, which I've come to like a lot.
Yep.
And I started with this preset of theirs called 80s drums, but I've kind of manipulated it a little bit. And I've also followed it up. It's got some kind of post EQ and damping EQ there within it, but I've also high passed it, taken some low mids out, and it looks like I've kind of notched like a higher harmonic of the snare drum out of it particularly. So that's the sound with the snare top, close mic, and also the toms and everything going to the reverb.
Interestingly, on the EQ that you've moved there, that's the opposite of what Chris Lord-Alge often does. He's like boosts the high end on his reverb,
right,
which is interesting. But is that a generally approach that you like to keep your drum reverb in the mid-range?
I suppose so. I mean, I would say I think probably that specific reverb patch is quite high-endy. I mean, well, yeah, it's not the brightest in the world, but I think it's also a lot to do with how that interacts with the real or sampled room sound. I think I prefer the high end of a snare room sample than the high end of a reverb to be cutting through. And I'm not really wanting there to be perceptible reverb audible in the final mix. I mean, you might know just by implication that it's there, but I don't really like when you can hear the character of a reverb in the mix. It just, again, it's that cohesion, integrity thing we were talking about before.
Sure. And is this the only drum reverb you've got? Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. And moving on, you made the decision to use the waveform edited toms.
Yeah.
And not used any samples, if I'm not mistaken. And is there a lot of EQ work or compression work on each of the toms?
There is, yeah. There's a little bit of bleed that's coming through that, you know, again, I wanted to show you the way that I typically work, and I typically will try and engineer for like as minimal bleed as possible so that I can always use the toms without much sample or just paste in a clean hit right at the end or whatever. So I'm using this same trick of expanding the high end. Here I've reduced the crossover all the way down to like 320-ish, it would seem. And then I'm doing this is just each tom will have had a slightly different EQ, I think. Yeah. Different amounts and positions of low cut, just trying to get the boxy frequency thing sorted, you know. There's quite a lot of, because of the different tempos, you know, there is a sense that some of the fills are being hit really hard and some other ones are more, you know, kind of fluttered, and on those it becomes very low end heavy once you kind of normalize out the volume. So I think, yeah, I haven't done much dynamic EQ or anything. I don't think I've done any of that, but I do remember going, yeah, it looks like I've done automation on some of the tom hits, just kind of trying to flatten them out so that some fills aren't way louder than others.
Yeah.
So, for example, on this one. You can still hear there's a fair amount of bleed coming through on there, but obviously he's playing pretty fast. That's more like what the toms sound at their best to me when they're being hit a little bit harder, you know.
Sure. Are you taking The reverb feeds from the individual toms or the tom sum?
They're coming from the sum in this case.
Sum.
Yeah.
What processing have you got on the sum, Adam?
So I've got a transient designer, boosting attack and a little bit of sustain, and I'm automating that, mostly trying to ensure that the fast stuff has plenty of attack, and then the really hard hits I'm bringing that down on, so that there's a couple of bits like this little flomp on the floor toms here where with the transient designer set like that it would just be way too attack focused. So on that I've automated down the attack quite considerably. So I've got that going on. I have a limiter, which is similarly, kind of trying to trim a bit of transient off. So that's hopefully, that's providing me a little bit of elasticity with my transient designer. So, it's making it a little bit more forgiving, basically. The limiter's going to catch any big overs if they do occur. We've got, here I'm cutting up around like 15K, which is probably a bleed thing, and adding a tiny amount of 4K. Yeah, that will just be a tiny bit more kind of presence. And I have an automated EQ here, which is a high shelf cut, which for examples happens exactly on that hit I just showed you. Again, just trying to even out the timbre. So that's cutting by nearly 6 dB, a high shelf at 2K, preventing the stick attack from just being way too overbearing in that moment.
Fascinating.
It looks like that's the only moment. Maybe, I didn't seem to do it anywhere else. It might be that I kind of wanted to just make a little example of that to be able to talk about it.
And what was your approach with the metal work with the overhead mics?
So let's have a look. So firstly, I tend to sum together, the close mics and the overheads and process them on a bus. It looks like I've done something on the ride, which is fairly typical. A ride in person can sound so clangy and loud, and then you hear it in the close mic and it doesn't have the same kind of impact. So I think I was trying to I actually took some top end out of it, it seems. Let's find a moment where it's getting hit. I assumed he was going to be blasting on the ride there. Oh, here we go. So without my treatment, that sounded like... Just focusing it in a bit more on like the specific frequencies of the bell.
Less piercing.
Yeah. But then apart from that, everything else is just, hasn't got anything on it. It's just leveled and then going to a cymbal bus.
And on the cymbal bus, is it your high pass filtering? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that looks pretty intense, doesn't it? Maybe scale that. So I'm using a low shelf rather than a low cut.
Okay.
But that's pretty aggressive to the point where it basically makes no difference, I think. Cutting a bit around 500, that will probably be a bit of boxiness on the snare particularly. Probably also, a lot of my EQ will be about the snare in this range as well, like the 1300 frequency range, which, that's probably to do with like the attack of the snare. And then it's really normal for me to cut quite a lot around like 6 or 7K. By, in this case, up to 8 dB with a little bit of dynamic push added to that as well. It looks like, I'm mostly cutting high end. Sorry, my finger on this is adjusting the slope without me wanting to. It looks like I'm mostly cutting top end. Once we get above like 3K, I'm mostly subtracting stuff because I guess it's quite a bright recording. If I get rid of that, so I think what's happened is as I've cut the low end out of that, I've needed to also compensate by cutting high end so it doesn't sound too thin. So that's my overhead EQ, which I got first up. I am, yes, this is interesting. I don't do this very often. I am saturating the top end just above 9 and a bit K and increasing the dynamics knob. So I'm essentially compressing and saturating just the kind of glossiness on the top of the cymbals. This is not a move that I do very frequently. But yeah, I think that's probably in an attempt to get the cymbals to sound really kind of washy and consistent. So without...
Yeah.
I'm also cutting some top end on that band as well. So I'm not necessarily trying to increase in general the amount of high end. I'm just trying to make the top end more complex and even. And then I'm using Soothe, which is a bit of a godsend. I really like to use this. I have a preset that I use as a starting point most of the time. So that's going to be dynamically reducing the high resonances in the cymbals. It looks like it's doing a lot, but I've got the sharpness and the selectivity turned up all the way. And basically, I don't think it changes the character of the cymbals too much. You know, it doesn't just turn them into white noise or something. But it just makes them a lot more listenable and therefore can be louder in the mix.
Yeah.
I've got this Apogee soft limiter clamping down on the snare. That's without. And then I have track spacer, and this actually relates to the vocals, which we'll get to. But I'm using track spacer. It won't be doing anything right now. If I play the full mix. Basically got the cymbals being ducked dynamically around the kind of S region of the voice.
Okay.
Because that's something which I found when working with bands with vocalists that need to be really upfront. You end up in this trade-off. They'll be like, oh, the cymbals are too loud, they're clouding my articulation. And they're right. So this is where something dynamic can help. So instead of having to just broadband make the cymbals quiet or do some really painstaking automation, stuff like this just allows the voice to not have to be super loud relative to the cymbals, and yet they can both be heard at the same time.
So the vocals side-chained to the...
Yep. And it's just acting from about 7K up, and with a really small amount.
Fantastic.
Because I don't want it to be audible that the cymbals are going weirdly.
Ducking, yeah. Sure. And then just briefly on the width of the drums, do you keep your cymbals entirely wide? And are you panning audience perspective or drummer perspective?
Drummer's perspective, although we're currently listening, I think we've got the left and right the wrong way around on the board. Yeah. So yeah, I'm always a drummer's perspective guy.
And you go hard left and right with the cymbals, or do you tote hard left and right? Fantastic. Moving onwards to the bass guitar, if we may.
Yeah.
Which, if I might comment at this stage, it was one of the aspects of, obviously I heard one of your earlier mixes and I do appreciate that you've revised it since, but one of the most apparent things with listening to your mix was the impact of the bass guitar and how the relationship with the bass and the guitar was a really interesting one. The presence of the bass was very strong in the mix, but without overpowering the guitars, which worked really well, and it gave it an impact and a density that was really nice about the mix.
Awesome.
So I think this will be a very interesting area.
Yeah, well, thanks for saying so. You know, as someone that has played professionally as a bassist, it's something where I feel like I really appreciate what bass can bring to the table and how much apparent power is lost from the mix when it's not doing that. So I didn't want to just kind of use like a chain that I might use, like the pedal that I developed with Dark Glass or Parallax. I wanted to try and work with what you've provided, and you provided lots of options. And I didn't necessarily know whether you expected people to just choose one and roll with it, but I just loaded all of them into the session and listened to them as a unit, and I was like, oh, that sounds pretty good. So that's what I did. I used all of the 5 tracks. We've got a DI, and we've got 4 different kind of amp style, like pedal ampy things running there. If I get rid of any of my processing here, the bass channels, so actually it looks like they're all flat apart from the DI, which I would expect I'm probably compressing. Yeah, so I haven't done anything to the individual channels apart from the DI, which I'm compressing quite hard with this 1176 kind of thing. So, sorry. So I'm seeing the DI as kind of like a counter to like the distortion that's present in all the other ones. I'm kind of wanting a bit more of the kind of round, flat low end you get from a DI, and also a bit more of the kind of stringy thwack that you get out of a DI. But it's so much more dynamic. I feel like compressing it's kind of necessary to be able to have it fixed at a certain level relative to everything else. Everything else is flat. So we've got the DI. that's parallax, I assume.
Yep.
We've got scar bass and dark glass pedal. And so I think parallax and the dark glass pedal are really the ones that bring the mid-range grind, the scar bass and the kind of, I'm assuming it's like an Ampeg style amp, bringing more of that kind of scoopy, slightly gritty kind of drive thing. And they all combine together to sound like. Which, as you're hearing, I think is sounding really cool. So that's why I decided just to work with everything. You know, I heard that and I thought that's a really good sounding bass channel to work with. So the first thing I've just got a gain reduction here because I've got 5 tracks, all of which are quite loud. I've nipped it back over 12 dB just to have it in like a decent level range to then process. I'm using this plugin, which I don't use a whole lot, made by Dan Corniff. It's like a kind of channel strip, which, to be honest, I find tricky to figure out what's going on with it sometimes because of the orientation of everything. But essentially, I'm primarily using it as an EQ and as a compressor.
Okay.
So we've got a low cut at around 180 hertz, so kind of reducing a little bit of tubbiness. We've got some boosts, one around about 900 and one around 2K. Those will both be bringing some kind of clanky, clacky character that, to be honest, I don't find super pleasant to listen to on its own until you get used to it. But in the mix is what really allows it to cut through. So, oh dear, what have I done there? Yeah. So, without the EQ in, I'm just trying to figure out if I can do a. Well, I'll just switch everything in and out. So, we're using those EQs. We've got his insufferable mid-range filter, which is like a notching EQ with an octave up harmonic as well, which I've got tuned to 3K with like a minus 10 dB reduction. It's pretty awesome. And I'm also using a bit of kind of VCA compression with a medium attack and fast release. So with it out, it sounds like. And then with it in. I should add also it's low passing all the way down to 6K.
Right. Yeah.
So that's reducing quite a lot of top end. So I'm using that kind of just like a console channel strip kind of thing. Here we've got a whole mountain range of EQ, so that's kind of revoicing the low end, making sure it's got plenty of 80 hertz energy, reducing the 250 kind of mud zone. Oops. Sorry, I have to keep undoing the moves I'm unintentionally doing. I've got more of this 900 boost, kind of 850, 900. For me is that really key frequency to get the bass to honk through the mix. But it looks like I'm doing it dynamically. And here again, that's the kind of thing where I'm trying to make sure that the sound is consistent in that aspect. Notching, this is all just kind of dialed in by ear, basically, just finding the right spots to enhance the presence and reduce the mud. So without. And this move particularly of reducing the mid and enhancing the low end is giving us like a clean focus on the note of the bass without too much of like the immediate proximate overtones, which can kind of make it a bit more difficult to hear like the note. Then I'm using a multiband compressor here also to flatten out that presence region. So this looks like it must be from, it's from like 700 and up. Set with a slight amount of boost, but quite a lot of cut. And that's keeping the timbre consistent. A bit like kick drum, consistent timbre is key when it comes to bass. Depending on, the way it's played. If it's played with a pick incredibly consistently, you might not need to do this. If something's played with fingers or played with a bit more alternate picking, it can start to become necessary to kind of use these dynamic devices to make it sound very consistent. Then I love this plugin. It's made by a friend. It is a low end compression, and then you've got this kind of big low end bump that you can add afterwards. So it's kind of just doing that low compression thing. So you can see here, if I turn that down, it's compressing the low end. It's compressing the low end by like 2, verging on 3 dB, and I'm compensating for that.
Okay.
But then this enhanced frequency just throws in this really delicious 80 hertz that I love. So,
Oh yeah.
I think it was set around there.
Yeah.
Just
Not seen
sounds
that
massive.
one before. That's
It's very cool.
very nice.
Yeah. And that rounds out the processing that's to do with the bass. I then have track spacer on here, which is sidechained from the kick drum.
Okay.
And that's limited to just under 115 hertz. So if I play that in conjunction with the kick drum, so having made the bass sound as huge as it does, it's kind of our responsibility to make sure it doesn't step all over the kick drum, and that does a really good job of it. So
Sure.
that's a way of being able to make the bass huge and upfront,
Yeah.
and not have too much.
And obviously it sounds quite transparent because it's only hitting the lower frequencies. You're not hearing any pumping or breathing in the bass. It sounds really natural.
Yeah, and I have it set as fast as it can go, and it's got 15% of the actual effect on, so
Superb.
it's not huge.
I'd love to briefly, if we could have a look at the guitars, and then we'll have a listen to the guitars and bass together, if that's
sure.
okay. That'd
Yeah,
be awesome.
So the guitars are reamped through a 6505 Plus we were talking about before, kind of like a slightly tighter version of the original 5150. I've used the same tone on all of them, so I may as well play the 4 of them together. I've used all the quads at equal volume, and on the individual tracks I just have like a gain drop of 7 dB because I recorded them quite hot. So guitars on their own. So as we were talking about before, I'm a big fan of having access to the cab sound after the fact in the form of an impulse. I think the cab is such a huge part of getting the guitars to sit in the mix right. And I can commit to an amp sound very happily, but committing to a cab sound for me is really, you're committing a lot if that's what you've done. So I'm loving to use this plugin which I developed with my company. It's all based around Mesa Boogie Oversized cabs, which for me are just, the sound of this genre. And I've used one of the cabs here with a 57 as the primary. You can see that fader is a lot higher than on the others, with a little bit of C414 for extra low end, and a bit of a 421-2 for a little bit more kind of scrape as well. So, oops, let's put that back. So this is what it sounds like. I mean, without it, you've just got a DI from an amp, and then with. EQ wise, I've done a little bit of kind of not quite notching, but narrow band cuts, just kind of compensating for any particularly sticky outy, spiky stuff in the top end of the speaker. I am boosting a little bit around 1K just to add that intelligibility in the mix.
Yeah.
Probably the most crucial thing of any is kind of cutting around 250, 300, not super wide Q, just enough to take out the kind of any woolliness that's in there. You kind of want to find the frequency spot where you barely notice it when you cut it, if that makes sense. Like, it really should not cause the guitar sound to fall apart. You're just kind of making some space there, and it should enhance the clarity. I've got a multiband, like a dynamic thing here, kind of doing the classic multiband expansion on the low end.
What frequency is the dynamic EQ at there?
So that's set around 115 hertz, and I've used one of these bands with like the 24 dB per octave slope, so it looks a bit more kind of trapezoidal, just to be able to have more of an impact on a wide range of frequencies there. And then simple high pass at 60 and low pass at 10K. So without EQ, sounds like. So really, for me, guitar EQ should just be about a more controlled version of the raw sound. The raw sound maybe can be a little bit bigger than you need, but it should have all of the character that you want, and you shouldn't be trying to incorporate that by using processing.
Sure. So you got all 4 guitars at equal gain?
Yep.
and you're EQing them all collectively on the sum.
Yep.
And is there any other processing on the sum?
There is a little bit of stereo image widening, just a touch.
Yes.
Just a tiny bit with this classic S1 imager here. So
Yeah.
you barely hear it, just only up to 1.12.
Yeah. What's the first processor on the signal chain?
That is the cab impulse response.
That's the cab impulse response. Fantastic. And do you ever use tape emulation or clipping on guitars?
No, pretty much never, no.
No. Brilliant. If we could have listened to the guitars and the bass together, if that'd be possible. Thank you. Lovely. You've got a real separation there, but they're not masking each other. They're not at all fighting with each other, but they're working really, really well together. That sounds absolutely great.
Thanks. That's that thing we were talking about earlier for me of that. This, I don't know what that's connected to in real life, but there's some massively powerful kind of grinding I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
If it's an animal or a machine.
Yeah.
It's somewhere between the two. Isn't it?
Frederick Nordstrom likened it to, I just want it to sound like a tank. He's putting the mix together and I want it to sound like a big tank. And that was his visualization, which I love.
Really kind of echoes with the kind of things I was talking about, isn't it? Yeah.
And with your low-end management, we looked at a number of techniques which were really interesting there, which was the frequency-dependent ducking of the bass from the kick drum. With the low-frequency content of the guitars, are there any general principles you'll look at in how it interacts with the bass and this relationship with the kick drum? Is there any sort of mixed theory that you generally go with? Is it just analysis and listening to it?
Yeah, it's just error checking when I'm listening. If I can hear the palm mutes, like if I'm aware of this swelling sensation on my ears as the palm mute's happening, then I know that the guitars are maybe just kind of... Mixing for me is about reducing distraction, you know, and if I feel like I'm being distracted by this kind of pumping low end on the guitars, then I know I need to do something about it. You pretty much always do need to, with heavy guitars, do something to reduce that. Or, I mean, if you don't, then you've probably taken too much low end out of them at some point in the chain.
Yeah, absolutely. And guitars, similarly panned, hard left, hard right. And there's no stereo. Do you ever stereo widen the bass a little bit? You looked at a little bit on the, you know, like the upper frequency, sort of like 900 upwards, spreading the bass. Is that something you'll ever do?
I have done it. It's not something I do by default. It's more when the client seems to want that kind of sound, or if you're going for, you know, a certain reference or a specific effect.
For sure.
I've done it when there's more of like an isolated solo bass kind of thing, like a cleaner tone maybe. It can be nice for it to occupy a little bit more of the frequency range, but no, generally not in the mix.
And can we briefly consider how the strings and the brass section interacted with the bass and the guitars?
Yep. So I've not done very much to them. It's about leveling. You know, they're quite nice level waveforms anyway. I'm sure these are out of a library, right? So they've been...
Yeah. They were different libraries that I compressed them down when I created the stem.
So, you know, you can looking at it visually, you know, it's not going to need a huge amount of dynamic treatment. When you get live strings, it can be like, you know, whisper quiet and then crazy loud. And you get into challenges of how to flatten that without it losing something. But it looks like what I've done here, so there's this move that I love doing on additional production stuff, which is a mid-only cut around the kind of 300 to 500 area, somewhere in there. And it just instantly makes things wider. It looks like I'm also cutting a bit about... As you can see, I'm more of a subtractive EQ guy. Maybe those frequencies were kind of jumping out, this kind of like 4 and a bit and 2 and a bit. But I want to show you what the strings sound like with and without that mid-only cut. So without, without.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You can really hear the image shift, can't you?
Suddenly so wide. And you still get the mids represented of the strings because it's on the sides. Yeah. And that can play nicely with the guitars if you balance it well. But that mid stuff down the middle, if we've chucked as much mid as we have into the bass, you've got the kick and the snare trying to make themselves known down the middle. And then most importantly, you've got the vocal as well.
Yeah.
I find that clearing that space down the mid makes such a big difference to the clarity of a mix.
So the mid cut is only on the mid channel of the strings.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And with the brass, was there any similar treatment with the brass
Let's
section?
see.
Or is that less of
No.
a concern? Because I don't think there's as many vocals in at that section.
Yeah, for whatever reason, I didn't find it necessary to do that. It's the piano and brass stem. And having just said that I'm more of a cutting, subtracting kind of guy, I've obviously boosted here.
Yeah.
I think I just felt like I wanted a bit more presence out of that. It does look like I actually separated the piano and the horns though. So there was a section here with the piano, which I've chopped and put onto a fresh track to be able to process it differently.
Yeah.
And here I've high passed. But I've also used Spiff. Have you ever used this plugin?
I haven't.
Program dependent transient designer, basically.
Okay.
Same people that make Soothe.
Yeah.
So it's a really, I find it a much more transparent way of dealing with transients. And I probably just wanted to reduce that hammer-like attack on the piano, which sounds really impressive in solo, but in the mix, it's like, either you make that so it's the loudest thing in the mix to be able to hear what the piano's playing, or you don't hear the notes of the piano. So,
Sure.
so without, well, in fact, I'll show you the delta of what it's doing. That's always quite interesting. So without it. And this.
Yeah, just softening it nicely, yeah.
And that's to allow it to be made loud.
Yeah.
I actually, you did say, you know, if there was anything that I wanted to add to the mix, to go ahead and do it. So I did. In this particular section, when everything's kind of, what is it, like a little, how do you describe this little part of it, a little symphonic break or whatever? Kind of ballad moment. I added all sorts of little loops of shakers and stuff, like.
Awesome. Atmospheric's beautiful.
Yeah, tambourine sent through a big reverb for those individual hits. You've got these real played loops of a cabasa and a double shaker, and then there's obviously a big boom. I can find one of the biggest problems in mixing is when you're getting in and out of a huge shift in feel. So going from heavy into really light and then back again. You can often end up feeling like the light section comes out of nowhere. And then oftentimes going back, if you've made everything sound lovely and smooth and relaxing, the guitars come back in again and your eardrums are being shredded and you hate it, you know, even if nothing's changed from how it sounded before. So, you know, having that boom, for example, adds a little bit of extra atmosphere and kind of connects the two. So just gives a bit, it feels like the previous section's just carrying a little bit into it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then, you know, without the shakers and stuff, it's such a big change in feel to like this kind of, is it half time or quarter time? I just kind of felt like it felt a bit empty. So having something kind of just giving it a bit more drive in a non-heavy way, and plus, again, creating a bit of ambience on the snare hits with the tambourine. It's quite an 80s kind of thing. You know, it's a bit Kate Bush or whatever, but it seems to work quite well just to make the section have a bit more of an atmosphere to it. So.
Yeah. Awesome.
And then I've replicated that at the outro where it's that again.
And moving on to the vocals, Adam.
Yeah. So let's see what I'm doing. I've used the stems that you provided. I'm compressing, even though they're quite compressed. For me, you can just never compress vocals enough.
No.
You know, I think that just compressing a vocal is so much of getting it over the finish line, getting it to be super flat, because you're up against waveforms like these guitars up here that are just so rectangular and a distorted bass, and it's like unless the vocal is really, really flattened out, you're going to struggle to find a level.
Yeah.
You can do it with automation, but it's much for muchness, really. And I like the character of
the character and the coloration as well, absolutely.
So I'm using this 1176. I really like this one on voice, this Purple Audio one from Plugin Alliance. So lead vocal, if I turn off everything that I've got on the vocal. So
From the solitude of Trojan's horse.
sorry, turn off the delay.
From the solitude of Trojan's horse.
So in addition to already being quite flattened, I'm not afraid of that thing going way above the 10 dB reduction mark. But hearing it, there's quite a lot of kind of mid-range radio frequency on its voice, which for me needs to be tamed for it to sit into the mix. So let's see if that's what I've done. Yeah, so I've obviously done quite a big and dynamic cut around 1K. I'm cutting some high-end dynamically. Again, dynamic treatment for vocals for me is such a game changer because a voice is so naturally different in timbre as you go through the different ranges and different sections of the song that trying to do it with EQ is just so frustrating, I find. So using dynamic bands is huge for me. So without...
From the solitude of Trojan's horse. Race Jericho's falling walls.
So we've got that. And that's sending directly to a delay, which I've got, which the lead tracks are all going to. This is Echo Boy Jr. doing... I like this ambient setting on the Echo Boy Jr. because it's kind of a bit of a delay and verb in one feeling. I think it's only delay, but it's just got that spread. So
from the solitude, Jericho's falling walls, my Victoria.
And it's really important to me that the vocal ambience doesn't have much high or low end, because that will instantly start eating up more space than it should. It's about making it, making the voice sound longer somehow, if that makes any sense. And then that's going to a bus where all the vocals are going to, where I'm trimming the level, using Soothe, which I love for just making the S's sound right. You know, kind of gets rid of a lot of the more peaky stuff in there so that the pronunciation sounds really good and it just sounds a lot less harsh. I'm reducing harshness again with this kind of 4K cut and boosting a bit of 12K, as well as also some 400 cut. All of this will be kind of just trying to make it sound like it lives in the same space as the rest of the mix. And for me, the big giveaway is if I can't find a level for the vocal, then it's not EQ'd right. You know, like that's the big one. So once I get it to the point where it feels like the level is not so critical, then I know that the EQ is in a good space. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The doubles and stuff have... So I've actually done a big mid cut only on the vocal doubles.
Okay.
Making some space in there, but that's following up what looks to be pretty much a duplicate of the same EQ that was on the lead vocal. And same on the backing, so I've duplicated that same processing across all. So on the guttural vocals, I've increased the high end a little bit, maybe trying to make them sound a bit raspier.
Sure.
Giving them a little bit more low end as well, so these sound slightly different. I've also micro shifted them a little bit, so.
Is it just the one delay line that you've used and no separate reverbs on that? No, okay.
Just that, yeah.
Fantastic.
But what I have done is created a couple of throws where I've got a channel here with 100% wet, got a limiter going into like a really crazy kind of ambience preset, and that I just pull little sections from the vocal onto that channel to be able to have that happen. So you get these moments like.
Yeah.
Now I've just done that in a few places around the song.
Beautiful. And lastly, can we just have a brief look at your master bus processing?
Yeah, 100%.
approach?
So there's a few things. I mean, I should mention about the drums that the whole time we were listening to the drums, they were going through the parallel compression from this distressor style thing, and then I was also EQing some 5 and a bit K into them and some 12 and a bit K and a little bit of low end as well. So that's it.
Using the mix control, are you there? Is that
on the compressor? Yes, mix control.
Yeah.
Set to 35%. The side chain has got the high pass and the mid boost or band pass filters engaged, so it's not getting triggered from the kick too much, which is kind of key.
excellent?
And then some brightening going on the bus there. So there was some, even though you mostly saw me reducing frequencies, there was some boost further down the chain. And then that's going to an instrumental bus. So this is everything apart from vocals. I've got a gain channel here, so that's knocking everything back 3 dB just to get into my compressor at a more usable volume. I'm using the SSL style compressor. These are my settings that I use on everything and have done for the best part of 10 years. Fast attack 0.3 on the SSL, fastest release 0.1, ratio 4, and this has got the side chain low cut so the kick isn't driving the compression too hard, which would be a big issue with fast kicks where you'd have to have the kicks really quiet, else you're triggering way too much compression.
What level of gain reduction is going on there?
So it's specifically targeting the snare drum to have about 3 or 4 dB.
Yeah.
So. So what that's doing is it's, if I take it off, the snare drum's just too loud by 3 dB. But by having it work like this, where the snare is too loud and I'm ducking it, it's ducking the whole mix at that point. So the snare is cutting through as though it was really loud, but actually it's not as much of a jump on your ears.
Yeah.
So without it, and with tucking it back, and it does give a nice little envelope on the character as well.
Yeah.
And then I'm doing this mix, like low mix, heavy compression on the whole mix as well. So 100%, that's giving quite an aggressive pumping character, and I'm just blending in a little bit of it. So without that one,
is that a 70? Is it a FET compressor or?
it's based on a Focusrite Red.
Focusrite Red, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's got fairly slow attack, but I don't think the attack goes very slow on it. It's not like an 1176, but it's not super slow.
Almost like parallel compression there.
Yeah, it is. It is a bit of parallel compression, just kind of giving a bit of a glued feel. The whole mix then runs into my master bus, including the vocal stuff, and I'm using this plugin called Gullfoss, which
Fantastic.
I really like.
It's awesome.
It's become just a dedicated thing which I always have in my mix. So 20% recover, 20% tame is where I'm at. And it's just, for me, it's like what bus compression is to levels, this is to EQ. It just gives you that elasticity to be able to push and pull a little bit more. And as you go from one section to another, like I was talking about earlier, if you go into a soft section, it just makes sure that the frequency range doesn't change so much that it becomes really jarring when you go between things. So obviously there's no music playing, so it looks crazy. Let's see what it looks like when it's playing. If I bypass it.
Yeah.
It's not super noticeable, but it just
really helps.
Yeah.
It's subtly really just, even if you're getting 3 or 4% from it, it's start adding up all the 3-4% she gets from somewhere else, and it's significant. Yeah, it's a lovely bit of processing.
It just, and I don't feel like it paints you into a corner. Like, it doesn't have like a sound that completely changes your mix. And as you can see, I've just I've bracketed off the very top and bottom, because sometimes I felt like it was making the top, having just said what I said, sometimes it was making the cymbals too bright and kind of flattening the character in a way that I didn't like. So I've it's not doing anything above, or it's doing reduced amount above 10K and below 30, which...
And then you got a limiter out last on the chain.
Got some tape emulation.
Tape emulation, yeah.
Which I put after Gullfoss.
Yeah. Because
it is kind of a part of the sound of my mixes. It kind of brings things a bit more mid-forwards and a bit more just complex sounding.
Yeah.
And it also has a bit of that low bump that works well on the kick. And then, my limiter, which I've got set fairly conservatively. So as you can see, it's only really doing anything on the snares. If I were to look at what that's like for loudness on my mix.
Ten lefts.
Yeah, pretty respectable.
Yeah.
It's not quiet, but it's not winning the loudness war either. So
no.
And that's generally what I'm aiming for. When I mix, I have the limiter on, set around there, and then bypass and center mastering.
Sure. Adam, thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. Thank you.
Much, Mark. It's been very cool. I really enjoy talking about all these kinds of things, especially the philosophical, conceptual thing, and I look forward to seeing what the results are.
Thank you.